everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Cara Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and tonight I'm very happy to welcome you to our launch events, Publication Day for Lori Ostlund's Are You Happy? Let's give a hand for Lori. Lori is joined tonight by Oscar Villalon. Let's give a hand for Oscar as well. Thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here, both in person and online. Hello, online audience. And is anyone saving these seats? Are these for?
I'm not saving them.
These are for A students, this front row. If anyone wants to sit down in the front, you're welcome.
Actually, the ones who are always late who are not having to sit in the front in the class, right? Because nobody wants to.
I was going to say we won't call on you, but I actually do have a little plug that might entail us calling on you. So, Lori very, very graciously picked up this copy of Zizova, the latest issue of Zizova, and this copy of Richard Steichen's Crush. So if you have not already, there's some pieces of paper at the back desk. You can write your name on said piece of paper, put it in the little bucket with the other names. If we call on you during the Q&A portion, I'm told that a question will be asked of you.
We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. But you have
figure it out. But you run the risk of being put on the spot.
Okay.
That's true.
So think about it. The risk is probably worth the reward. So think about it.
And I don't think that's the most recent.
No, it is a copy.
Yeah, so it's one that I had two copies of.
Thank you. So you get a fabulous issue of Zizova regardless. But now is the time to do that. While I am talking, please go ahead, enter your name into the bucket, and we will get to you. I have very brief business before I let these two take over. Now is a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. Picture taking is fine. I am told it is good. The rule that we have at Green Apple is that you cannot take a bad picture of our authors. So only good pictures. No bad pictures. It's kind of meant to be more funny than that. But no bad pictures allowed, only good photos. But the point being, please don't take a call in the middle of the event. And please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event you are currently attending. We are starting May out very strong with Lori this evening. Please do buy books if you're able. Thank you so kindly. We always appreciate it. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books. And then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone who pre-ordered Are You Happy? We really, really appreciate that. It means a lot to an author to have their book ordered before it's even in the world. And thank you for ordering from us, from your local independent bookstore. We always appreciate that. So thank you very much. I can't say it enough. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two writers who are joining us tonight. First, Oscar Villalon is the editor of Zizova. Let's give just a little bit of love to Zizova. Recipient of the Whiting Literary Magazine Prize. His work has been published in several publications, including The Believer, Stranger's Guide, Alta, and LitHub, where he is a contributing editor. He lives in San Francisco with his wife and their son. Let's give one more hand for Oscar Villalon. And last but most certainly not least, Lori Ostlund is the author of the story collection The Bigness of the World, which won the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction, the California Book Award for First Fiction, the Edmund White Debut Fiction Award, and was a Lambda finalist. Her second book, After the Parade, was a finalist for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, the Joyce Carol Oates Prize, and was a New York Times Editor's Choice. Lori is the series editor of the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction, and her latest book, Are You Happy?, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Lori.
How do you do, Lori?
Thank you. Hi, Oscar. So those of you who know we have a cat might realize that this Oscar is not a cat.
No.
This is actually the better Oscar to be in conversation with. So I think, and I'm really so delighted that he agreed to join me. And a thank you to the bookstore, to Carr. They've been great through all of this. And to my editor, who is here somewhere, Emily. representing Astor House there. What are you sitting on, a small stool? So, which is so great. And thank you to all of you. I mean, this is just, it's a strange time to be launching a book. It's a strange time to be doing anything. So I do so appreciate seeing you all here. Did you have cake? I'm guessing someone had cake because the cake seems gone. Excellent.
Well, Laura, I think before we begin, I was going to ask you to read. Okay. And then after you read, then we'll dive into the conversation.
That sounds great. Can everyone hear? Sure, I put the book marker in the wrong place. There it is. Everyone can hear? Yeah. All right. So I am going to read from the beginning of A Little Customer Service. And among the many reasons I'm going to read from it, a main one is that this story first ran in Ziziba. Many years ago. Not many years ago, but some years ago. Yeah. So I thought that it seemed fitting, since I'm here with Oscar, to read from A Little Customer Service. A Little Customer Service. That fall, and well into winter, Tara lived with a woman 17 years her senior, though most days she felt like the older one. She attributed this to the fact that the woman, her name was Gretchen, was rich and always had been, a state of affairs that had resulted in a certain type of arrested development. Tara had lived long enough without money, 32 years, which was her whole life, to know that money separated people from both misery and common sense. She was not overly familiar with lesbians, so she did not realize that Gretchen's arrested development might also be caused by that. Not by being a lesbian per se, but by having spent the first 40 years of her life ignoring desire, channeling it into gestures and activities better suited for a schoolgirl. Take, for example, the way that Gretchen wooed her into having sex the night they met, by inviting her to leg wrestle. They lay on the rug in front of the fireplace, hips touching heads in opposite directions, on the floor of Gretchen's adobe house on Canyon Road in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and all Tara had seen was the luxury around her, and not the strange and almost heartbreaking fact of a 49-year-old woman coaxing intimacy out of leg wrestling. They'd met earlier that night at a tourist restaurant, all coyotes and turquoise, where Tara was waiting tables and Gretchen was eating a Cobb salad, seemingly without enjoyment, as though eating were more of a job than waitressing. When Gretchen was done sighing over her salad, done lifting her fork and knife up and down as though they were a set of barbells, she began waving frantically for the bill, even though she could see that Tara was covering too many tables, or should have been able to see this if she knew anything about waiting tables, or seeing the world through someone else's eyes. When Tara handed her the bill, Gretchen handed it back with her credit card, making a point to not even glance at the total. Tara did not know whether she was demonstrating her faith in Tara's math skills and overall character, or reflecting her casual disregard for money. But either way, Tara was not impressed. Then, after Tara had swiped the card and delivered it back to the table with a mint, a pen, and the receipt, after Gretchen had signed the receipt, pocketed the pen that was not hers, popped the mint in her mouth, and was free to leave, a need that her wild gesticulating minutes earlier had seemed in service of, she stayed at her table another 45 minutes, watching Tara take orders and fetch condiments and be polite to a group of 6 men whom Gretchen would later declare undeserving of politeness. The men were dressed in matching sky blue t-shirts that said, "First in customer service," though the phrase customer service was in quotation marks. So the t-shirts actually said first in customer service. Tara laughed when she saw the shirts. She wished that she could laugh with someone, but she did not work with people who thought about things like irony and punctuation. In fact, just the week before, the manager had pulled her aside to say that the kitchen staff had complained about the way that she recorded her orders. "It's all the extra codes," he said. "You're confusing people." Code, she repeated, truly perplexed, and the manager pulled out her last order. Burger on whole wheat, semicolon, hold the mayo and cheese, and tapped his pen on the semicolon. This, he said. That's not a code, Tara said, that's a semicolon. She took classes at the community college and hoped to cobble together a career someday from the things that she was good at, among them punctuation and multitasking. A code is, she paused, hearing her tone become instructive. You know, when you don't want other people to understand. Well, said the manager, congratulations. Nobody understands. And then you need to knock it off. As she waited for the bartender to fill another pitcher, she studied the men. She knew their story. Knew, that is, that the shirts had been presented to them, probably along with this trip to Santa Fe, to reward them for a job well done. Just as she knew the sort of men they were, men proud to be good at their jobs, to be the recipients of shirts that proclaimed as much, or claimed to proclaim as much. She wondered whether even one of them understood that the shirts were actually mocking them. Nice shirts, she said, setting down their third pitcher. All 6 men smiled proudly. Most people did not want a waitress who corrected their grammar. It was like going to a dentist and having him try to save your soul, which had recently happened to her. Tuition was due, and she needed her tips, so she smiled and moved on.
Thank you, Lauren. Before I ask you my first question, I just want to say how much I enjoyed this collection. The story that you just read that we published, some years ago in Zizua, encapsulates a lot of the major themes in the book. I'm particularly thinking of one is class, which I think is a big part of these stories, sexuality, labor. But I think the umbrella covering all this is this larger theme of lack of self-knowledge, or people who have self-knowledge but don't want to reckon with it. They'd rather compartmentalize it and try to live in this sort of form of denial. And I think, you address these things with this wonderful, I would say, suffusive with this sort of, I would almost call it wised up gentleness. And there's that humor, which you all just heard in the excerpt that you just read. And these become almost like a collection. I wouldn't say they're connected stories, but we see similar characters show up again and again, but it's almost like different iterations of their lives, in different stages of their lives, and how they are doing, or speaking to the title of the book, are they happy? Are they actually getting anywhere? As much as any of us is trying to do that in life. So that's a lot, and we're not going to be able to address all of that, but maybe I could, unpack a few of those things. And I want to start with actually the question of class. Can you all hear me? Is this okay?
Yeah.
In that story that you just read, Tara then goes with Gretchen, and she, as it turns out, is a wealthy woman, the heir to a paper fortune, which we don't quite know which one, but she does all right. And I guess what I wanted to ask you regarding that was what you do in this is that you look at class from the point of view of people who are straddling it. I wonder if you could speak to them. What I mean by that is folks who come from some sort of maybe a blue collar background, and suddenly you have a college degree, maybe you have a graduate degree, but still you're a server somewhere, or you're just getting by trying to teach classes at a community college. And I was wondering if you could to talk about that sort of dislocation that comes from having your foot in these two different classes.
Mm-hmm.
Or having a foot in these two different classes.
Yeah. Thank you, Oscar. I had no idea what the first question would be. And that's a good one. And I say that not by way of stalling. But it's true. When I think about these stories, that story is, I think, my most a story that's most overtly about class. But all of these stories, I think class is at least kind of the texture of the stories. And, I grew up in a hardware store in a town of 400 people. And, my wife she says that I was part of the petty bourgeoisie, but these stories, and I live in a much different world. The world I live in now is just a much different world than the world that I grew up in. And when I first realized that I wanted to write, I didn't know the world that I grew up in was maybe necessarily an odd one, or a world that required translation, interpretation for other people. And that's kind of how I think of these stories. I think of that I live in those two worlds. When I wrote, an interviewer asked me a couple of weeks ago, he said, "You write a lot about people who teach college." And he teaches college, and said I would have never thought to write about, because that seems like a taboo. But when I think of teaching college, my career has been, I've never had health care. I'm 60 years old. I've never had health care provided for a job. I've spent my life teaching. And that is a different sort of world. That's the world of adjunct teachers. That's a decision I made because I wanted to have a certain flexibility about where I lived, what my hours were like, how my life would be. And so that's the decision I made. But when I think of a story like the last story that I wrote for the collection, The Stalker, this is a story about, it was inspired by a stalker that I had years ago at a community college in New Mexico. And I think everybody who spent time in the collection, everybody who spent time in the classroom has had some sort of experience with not violence, but the sense that something could go wrong. And in this case, I had a stalker. And so when I thought about this story, I thought there's, I think, an assumed hierarchy in a classroom of who's in charge, who's in top. And the assumption is that it's the professor. But I'm interested in questions like, well, what happens when that person, that instructor, is in her 20s and is, really needs this job. And the student is twice her age and twice her size, right? And she's teaching nights in some remote campus. And then when you add in things like the fact that the story, as I thought of it, took place in a much different time, right? It took place in the 90s. And so she's also in the closet and dealing with all of these sorts of things. How does that change the equation in terms of, and so for me, that is a question of many things, including class.
Yeah, I would say, I loved how you wrote about teaching. One of the notes I made to myself when I was preparing for this interview was how sometimes when people write about what they do for a living, and let's say it's writers writing about teaching a class on writing, it's often arch, and sometimes it can come off as a little self-indulgent. But the way you relate it, it feels like, working, in a machine shop. It's labor. There's in that same story, The Stalker, there's a scene where the protagonist basically lays out to the administrator, you're going to make 22 cents an hour.
That was based on calculations that I did one semester,
Which then again, reinforces this idea through the entire collection of, I don't know if we're as cognizant of how we're living as we should be. Again, the sort of, there is, like, even in that a story, I wouldn't say quite a sense of hopefulness from the protagonist, but just a sense of, well, it's got to get better. Right? It just has to be better, which, hits a little differently right now, this time in our lives as a society, considering how things have gone since the 90s. that, indeed things will get better. Let's take that story as a point of departure, because, the title, Are You Happy, could apply to just about every one of the protagonists, most of who are women in the collection. But it seems that the people who really should be asking that question are often the men in the collection. And I was wondering if you speak to that a little bit. That's to say, the idea that the people who really need to interrogate that the most, the question of are they happy, are the ones least likely to do so.
First of all, to go back to this whole question of teaching, I read a review today, and the review said, after reading these stories, I wonder why Laurie Ostlund is still teaching. And those of you, because I do have people who've been in my classrooms, I love teaching. And so it made me laugh. It made Anne laugh. Anyway, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, is there a particular story you think of as a jumping off point to us?
I think of two. I think of course, the stalker.
Yeah.
In that piece.
Mm-hmm.
I also think of the father in the Aaron England story.
Mm-hmm.
I think of the men who get served by Tara in that story. And on, men who don't realize what they're saying, how uncomfortable it makes people, how menacing they are coming off, but also just raises the question, then do they even know what they're about?
I mean, that's an interesting question because, of course, so when I take a story like The Stalker, I have to, it started out with something that really happened. But at a certain point, I think, well, what is the story really about for me, and how do I get at that? So in reality, I had a boss who was great. And, she said, first she called me in the first week, and she's like, well, what do you think of this guy? And I said, yeah, he seems okay. I noticed he was odd. Because he just kind of sat in the back with his head down or like this, but he didn't sing. And then that quickly changed. But as soon as I called her, I came home and I was completely shaken by it. And I think what added to it was this remote campus. It was like out in this farming community. And you would drive and there would be like cows and then all of a sudden a campus. And I would get out of there at 10 and, I had to walk across this dark parking lot. And so by the time I came home, and it was a 45-minute drive, by the time I came home, I was really shaken by it. And I said, you have to call your boss. And then the next morning, you know how it is in the light of day, you assume that it wasn't really that bad, which is what the book is about. The book is about, I'm always interested in kind of how people navigate tragedy. And I'm interested in some of the stories, the tragedies happened, and it's really that kind of before and after moment. The tragedy splits life into, and then in other cases, there's that feeling of the tragedy that doesn't happen, but it's always there. It's just kind of in the air. And that for me was how that event was. I came home terrified, but the next day, I just thought, it's not that bad. And then I called my boss, and I got on the phone with her, and right away she said, you're calling about the guy. And then my voice just started to shake, and I realized I was terrified. But she handled it really well. And by really well, you will realize this is a different time. By really well, they asked me to choose one of my students as a bodyguard. And so that was how the situation was dealt with. So this poor guy, had to be my bodyguard. And my stalker was huge. Like, he was easily the largest person, I felt like, on campus. And then my bodyguard was, like my height. And who knows what a bodyguard job is? Like, you're there and you're taking the comp. And then all of a sudden, he's got to be my bodyguard. And so it was a very strange situation. And I am interested also in kind of, and this might get a little bit at your question, Oscar, I'm also interested in the ways that often other people's tragedies are the backdrops of our lives. And I think this happens over and over again. You know, that something really terrible is happening, and it's there. It's not in the fore. It's in the background. You know, it's not right there in the. And I think that is the case in a lot of these stories for some of the secondary characters you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think there's because of I was going to say there's sort of, if you will, exhilarating sort of mystery towards the view we have for these different folks, because when you, like, for example, that story, the stalker, and in other stories too, a lot of what's happening is the protagonist doesn't want to make waves.
Yeah.
The protagonist wants to be a good person.
Yeah.
You know, am I a good person? Am I being thoughtful enough? Am I being, selfless enough? And, these stories, beg the question, I mean, are you, or should you?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit towards that, this sort of, what happens when we try to live in this state of trying to be the quote unquote good person?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that question, I mean, just in a very personal way, is really close to home for me. Because, as I said, I grew up in this town of 400 people, and it's in the Midwest. And so where I grew up, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, that's the thing, where I grew up, the idea is compromise, because you can't live in a town of 400 people if you're at each other's throats. You have to find ways to compromise. And so this is the way that I grew up. And then went out into the world, understood that this probably was not the only way. And then I met Anne. We've been together 34 years ago, and Anne is like, if you ask her credentials, she'll be like, I'm a New Yorker. But that's just, that is how, and so she has a much different way of moving through the world. And the first time she's been to, I think, the town I grew up in twice. And the first 3 times, she says. So she's increased that number by 50%. The first time she came, I, as kind of, not a point of pride, but I took her to around back and showed her the back of our house, which is covered in bullet holes, because our neighbor had a gun and would just shoot indiscriminately. Like, she was always trying to squirrels and birds, and she had no control over it. And but to kind of loop back to Oscar's point, our instructions as children were, if she's shooting, go in the house. And so, and it's in one of the stories. I can remember being out there and I'm hanging stuff on the line, clothes on the line, and then this bullet goes by. And so I went in the house, I just left the clothes, and my mother came home and she said, why are the clothes just in a basket in the backyard? And I said, because Mary was shooting. And she's like, oh. I was by way of saying, like, you did the right thing. And so there's very much that feeling. And, because that is always my struggle. Like, I take a story like The Bus Driver, which is the first story in the collection. And that was a story, I think, I didn't know what it was about for the longest time. It began with, something that had happened when I was growing up. My friend who was abused by our coach. And I was the only one who knew, and I reported it, but it went nowhere. And so in that story, the main character is now, an adult. It's years later, but she still is thinking about this. But I started to, her partner is a lawyer, and her partner has this idea of justice that's tied very much to kind of what the powers that be can do. Like, the law can remedy a wrong. And that's true. The legal system is is important. But the narrator has seen a system fail because she's reported it and it's gone nowhere. She's reported it to a school system and it's gone nowhere. And so it is something that I think a lot about, that story. Anne and I always have this argument because I always feel like, what if I don't, rise to an occasion? What if I don't know what the right thing is? What if I don't know that this is what's in front of me? Which I think is where we are right now in time, right? What is the right thing to do? And so Anne and I have this argument because Anne's family was, on her mother's side, was all killed in the Holocaust. And she always says, you would hide the Jews. And I'm like, everyone says that. How do you know that you would, right? And so that's what the story kind of came out of was, this argument that we used to have about it. And I thought, okay, I'm going to look at that. Like, how do you address questions of justice when you yourself are not even sure that you understand what's going on or what the right thing is to do? So,
and I would say,
we're getting to 10 minutes.
Oh, yes. I would say, circling back to a little customer service, there is a line in there, I think, that explains, why, we want to be good, why these things get complicated, why we don't sometimes do what we think we should have done. And not in the most extreme circumstances, like we were just talking in terms of like, would I hide, people from an authoritarian regime, this sort of thing, but just in interactions with people on a normal, quote unquote, familial level or just relationships and this sort of thing. And it was in a scene in that story where Tara, God bless her, also has to get rid of all the mice in this rich woman's apartment or house. It's rather disgusting, but her children, her two boys, go with her to humanely release mice 5 miles away from where they live. And one of the older boy, I think he's clearly upset by this. The younger one thinks it's great, but the other one is very, very, very troubled. And at one point, he looks at Tara and he just says to her, Tara, do you feel sad about how big the world must seem to him right now? And for me, I thought that was almost like the key to understanding why we're so ambivalent. Because at the same time that, you need to stand up for you, you can't help but wonder, how other people are doing out there.
Yeah.
That was just...
I'm agreeing with you. Yeah. And I mean, yes, when I wrote that line, for me, that was what the story was about in many ways, was this idea of almost being paralyzed by what one should do because the world is, it's a theme that I come back to. There are certain themes that just kind of, that I just keep them, I guess my preoccupations, the things that I just keep coming back to. And that for me is one of them, this whole idea of how big the world must seem and what does that mean. And with my first book, The Bigness of the World, that was the kind of the overarching theme. And I saw it carrying into this one because I do think, I know I didn't see the ocean until I was, in my 20s. And I remember that feeling, like, it is so big. It was great. But I understood, like, it's the only way you really understand the world, I think, how big it is if you look at something that expansive. And I remember thinking, like, there are people who must see this and be terrified. And then there are people who must see it and just see possibility. And I understood both of those. And I do think that in that story, that is one of his brother absolutely thinks that his brother doesn't question. His brother just kind of moves ahead. But even for him, that the older boy who's so paralyzed by this can't imagine giving Tara up, that she will not be in his life anymore.
Yeah. It's this sort of paralysis that manifests itself in different ways throughout the stories. Switching gears a little bit lighter. These stories have something I found to be really delightful because I don't find it a lot in literary fiction, is pets. And what I mean by that is not pets as accessories, as to say, oh, and then they had a pet. but rather that the pets have a presence. They are, they speak to something. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Did you ever at any point think like, you can't write about pets, or you shouldn't include them in stories, or was it something that rather you just never questioned? So no, this is how the story has to be told.
Yeah, I'm always interested in what kind of, like who we are as people and the things that give us hope or a sense of well-being, not just the things that make us feel terrible. And for me, cats. I've always had cats. And your relationship with your animal, it's just so much less complicated than relationships with people. So of course it's hard to write an entire story that would, just be about the cat. But the thing that surprised me the most, and it's because I did not realize it, was that when the book first the galleys went out to some original reviewers, one of them said, there are a lot of cats in these stories and they're all named Gertrude. And I had no idea, first of all, how did they all get named Gertrude?
Mm-hmm.
And then how did that slip by me? I've never had a cat named Gertrude. And so, but I think it's just, I think the writers in the room will recognize this, that when you're working with characters, including cats, you give names that will stick in your mind, and so you give a name. And so at a certain point I thought Gertrude was a really funny name for a cat, and I was like, that would be a really funny name for a cat. So I put it in a story. I'm sure that's what happened. Then I was like, Gertrude is the name of cats when you're writing. And so just like I used to in my novel, I gave all of the teacher, it was about a young boy. All the teachers had the names of my teachers to keep track of it. So it was like, first grade teacher was Mrs. Leffler, the second grade teacher was Mrs. Carlson. And then I realized I had a problem. And when I talked to the lawyer, Scribner, they're like, you better talk to the lawyer about this, just to make sure there are no problems with things being factual. And she said, you better change some names of people in this. So I changed the names, and I would go to readings and people would ask me a question and I would be like, I don't know who that is. Because the names got changed so late in the process. So Gertrude is, I know that doesn't answer your question.
No, that's fine.
But I do think that animals are one of those things that just bring great pleasure to our lives. So, but
well, I was going to say, I think it's on a level of craft. It's such an important detail.
And the cat, there's the cat figures in quite importantly to the stalker.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other stories but the cats are running around in there. Yeah.
Well, because to me, I read that and say, well, this is a lived life. These are sometimes there's a lot of omissions in terms of the way you want to tell a story, and often the stuff you're omitting is things that could inform us better about who you are. A person who there's a wonderful story, where the couple, before they go to bed, have all their dogs and cats jump on the bed. They call it the raft. And it's such an incredible detail, I think, because it speaks to this idea of literally surrounding yourself by the people you actually love.
Right. Yeah.
And this is going to be your little island.
Yeah.
That amid all tumult, whatever is going on, there's this raft. There's this thing.
That's right. That's the title story. Are You Happy? The main character is a veterinarian, and he and his husband have all sorts of cats and dogs. And the big problem is that one of the cats insists on sleeping perpendicularly because he doesn't believe in parallelism, which is an ongoing struggle that in our lives we're always like, can we just learn about parallelism? Everyone goes this way in the bed. And so but those sorts of things, like you wake up in the morning, you sit down to write, and whatever was kind of the problem before you went to bed, and I'm sure that night it was just like, why can't Oscar sleep?
Me.
Yeah. Why can't Oscar learn to line up?
Well, because the bed's too small for me. That's right. All right. I think we'll now open up to the Q&A. Please. Everyone's don't have to be. Yes, please.
what's not in this book? In other words, you're writing stories all the time.
Mm-hmm.
How is this a collection? How did the collection come together? How did you choose the stories, and when did the theme kind of emerge for you?
Yeah, this collection is. So I was quite shocked when I looked at the back of the galleys, when the advanced reader's copy, and saw that it had been 10 years since my last book. That shocked me. I knew that it had been a while, but a lot of things had happened in that time, including, a very long fallow period, over 2 years where I didn't write. And so when I suddenly one day started writing again, at the end of 2022, I went back to the story that's now the novella. Just sat down and it was like something had shifted. And that story tripled in length. It became a novella. And all of these other things became clear. And one of the things that I remember realizing is I'm really tired of cynicism. I'm really tired of this kind of cynical approach to the world. And so the stories, I think, are probably dark in some ways. I think of them as kind of, I will say I write funny, sad stories. And I think that maybe captures it. But when I think about the book, I feel like there are a couple of stories that were written earlier, like maybe 12, 13 years ago, and then some stories in the middle period, and then the last 3 stories were written almost in a rush. Not in a rush, but quickly for me. I write really slowly. And when I sat down and kind of started looking at the collection, I thought, these are my preoccupations. These are the things I'm interested in. I talked before about tragedy and about how kind of certain things, the things that never quite happen, but they nonetheless are there and they hang over you, they control your life. That was an ongoing theme, things of identity, just who we are. Trying to kind of, the futility of trying to make peace with your past. Like you're just constantly doing that. And you think you've done it and then you've got to do it over again. And loneliness, I'm always interested in loneliness. And I don't mean that in kind of a glib way, but I am interested in loneliness and how this defines people. And so when I looked at the collection, I thought, yeah, those are all the stories there. I mean, the hard thing was that during the pandemic, my agent had struggled. And so I ended up breaking up with her, and I have no bad feelings toward her, but I needed an agent. And so I had to look for an agent with a short story collection, and that was hard. And I found a great agent, Henry. And one of the things, I showed him the collection, and I said, I think the collection could almost be called Guns, God, and Gays. Like, that feels like it could be the other title. And he's like, that's perfect. That's not the title. The title you have is not a good one. It was titled after the novella, Just Another Family. He said, it's great for the novella, it's not the title. And his favorite story in the collection was Are You Happy? And he said, that's the title that ties the collection together. And I liked how you articulated that earlier, Oscar. And I think that's true. I think that we have in this country preoccupations with a lot of things. Guns run through this, I grew up with lots of guns. I shot a gun for the first time when I was 12. I come from gun culture, that runs through it. And so all of these other sorts of things, but they, a preoccupation with happiness and with loneliness, which is maybe kind of the flip side of that. So all of these seem to come together. He and I agreed that one of the stories didn't work, and we threw it out, and then that was the collection. Thank you.
Yes.
Is there a story that was really hard to write? One that you had to go back to over and over again, or took the longest, or you had to set aside?
Okay.
A little bit about the process.
What's the story you had struggled with the most?
With the most, thanks, Hannah, for that question. I struggle with every single story. I just struggle. Like the novella. I mean, that took probably from beginning to end. I went back and looked the other day, and the first rejection I had for it in its much earlier form was in 2015, right? I went back to work on that story in 2022. So that is how long I was working on that story before it became the story that it is. What I've realized, and I'm not always good at following my own advice for myself, but what I've realized is that sometimes I can't finish a story because I don't understand something yet about the world. I haven't had a certain experience. And so the best thing to do is to get up from your computer and go into the world and do something. But it's very easy to just sit at the computer and hope that you figure it out. And so I have realized that I need to get up and take a walk or go to a museum or read something and come at it a much, different way than I'm coming at it now. Endings are always the thing that I struggle with the most. They just are. So I'm very, I'm a patient person, and I try to bring that to writing, and usually successfully. So honestly, all of them they were different struggles.
Yeah, one more? Yeah. So we'd like to ask the final question of the, yes, please.
So today I read The Bus Driver for the first time, and I absolutely loved it. It's very powerful. It's the first story, and as I picked up the book, and I thought, the way I approach most short story collections is instead of starting at the beginning, I just sort of look through it and think, oh, that sounds good, and start there. And then I thought, no, I won't do that because I know that Lori put these in a certain order. And I was wondering if you could explain how you do that with a group of short stories. Like what are you thinking when you sit down and you think, okay, I got all these stories, I'm going to go in this, and what goes first, and then at the end of, when you think my reader has finished this one, now what do I give them?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you order the collection?
I always feel like I'm failing at that. It's such a tricky sort of thing, and sometimes you just have to rely on other people. But I do, with the first story, I do tend to think of, like if I were in a bookstore and I opened this up to the beginning, would this voice pull me in? And does it seem somehow accessible, like a story people would want to read? And does it represent me? And so that was how The Bus Driver seemed to me. It was a story that was really important to me. I think with these last three stories that I finished, The Stalker, The Bus Driver, and Just Another Family, they were very personal for me. All of my work, it starts with something, something that an experience or somebody I knew, something that I can't quite let go of. And so those three in particular. So I put that one at the beginning, and I put the novella at the end. And then I relied on other people. My agent said, I think this one should come sooner. But I also think about things like if a story feels hard, like you get to the end of it and it's hard and you just need a breath. Like, do I want something that starts out a bit light, at least in the beginning, And so I think about the pacing in terms of humor as well.
All right. I guess we can.
Do we have time for our raffle?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
yes.
not a raffle.
Yes,
Everyone keeps
here
calling
comes
it a
Carl.
raffle, and it makes it sound like you're all going to be forced to buy tickets or something. But I just thank you. I wanted to say just a few things, because right now we know that that NEA has had major cuts. Zuzava, I think on Friday, so many journals and publishers learned that their grants were just cut, right? That money's not going to be coming. And it just seems to me, we all know this. This is not going to turn into any sort of lecture. I'm not going to get didactic. But it's just a moment to, I was thinking about how happy I was to be here with Oscar, and what he's probably dealing with, and so many journals are dealing with right now to keep afloat. And the same with, with independent bookstores. We, of course, need them. So yesterday when I came over to sign some books, I said to Anne, pick out, a book that to give away. Like, pick out a book and let's give it away. And I would encourage everyone else, if there is a book that you have been wanting to buy, just buy it tonight, because you were in a great bookstore. But I'm wondering if you can speak just quickly, Oscar, about what's happened.
Yeah, I think everyone is feeling anxious. Depending on your organization, the grants that you get from the NEA make a certain percentage of your budget. For some people, it's a lot. For others, it's not as much. But there's two things about it. They're distressing. One, you set your budget, and even if, like in our case, it's $12,500 that you're not sure you're probably going to get, it's still $12,500. You have to find someone. But really, what it is it's what it portends. It's everything that we know that's behind that. If it was just about the money, let's say there was a great global depression, of course, hard times for everybody. But you're not living in a burgeoning authoritarian state. It's a totally different thing. What makes this so, I think, distressing for everybody is that I don't think any of us think that's the end of it. None of us thinks like, well, that's okay, they'll be satisfied, and that's the end of that. You just don't get your money from the federal government, they'll leave you alone. That's probably not going to be the case. So I think that's the sort of fear, that we live in, which is no different from the fear that you're living in. So it's sort of like just another step towards a descent into the nadir. I think that's what that feels like.
So I don't know, I have subscribed to Ziziva for years. I have two favorite journals, and Ziziva is one of them.
Oh, thank you.
And you know that, Oscar. I absolutely love them. And so I would also, if you don't subscribe to Ziziva, but you think you might like to, just go home and look at the website tonight, because they are really a fabulous, fabulous journal. So we're going to do a drawing for, wow, people are not all taking part.
And then later you'll get visited by someone who wants to sell you some real estate.
Clavier. So
She always does that sort of thing.
what did
Oh, I put his name in, he didn't know.
Oh.
I had no idea.
He was out eating, so I put his name in.
Okay, so Clavier, you may be winning Ziziva. So, but you have to answer some questions first, and they're hard. So first of all, who is the editor of Ziziva?
There you go. Yes.
And I learned that just...
The second question, and there's no right answer here, is are you happy?
Tonight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You have to explain about the book function. This one, why it's there.
Carolyn Fuller.
All right.
Carolyn. So the second book, when I sent
You have to
Anne
explain why.
off to, so Anne and I both love poetry, and over the years we have spent so much time reading poetry to each other. We usually agree, but we came to our relationship with different touchstones in terms of poetry, but some that we both absolutely loved. And one poet that we sort of discovered together is Richard Siken. I don't know if people know him, but this is the
20th anniversary.
Yeah, the 20th anniversary.
Wow.
It's a fabulous book of poetry. So, Carolyn Fuller, do you like poetry? Are you happy? It's yours. Thank you, everyone.
Well, Laurie, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for the book, and I think you'll have books to sign. That's the impression that I get. And thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, and for everyone watching it at home.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
please, just once more. Just indulge me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Lord, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting us be a part of Are You Happy's journey.
No,
And Oscar, thank you so much, as always, for being a great interlocutor and reading so closely and thoughtfully. Thank you all for joining us and making this evening special, and for eating cake. We appreciate that. Thank you for making a cake and for eating it. I will be brief and just let you know that we have, if you are looking for a copy of Are You Happy, it's at the front register. You can find it there. Lori will be here signing books, so find them there. Bring them up here to be signed. Your homework tonight is to finish any empty bottle that we have, or any open bottle that we have, rather. They should be empty by the time you get to them. So, thank you so much. If you have any other questions, let me know. If not, we'll see you next time. Thank you.